And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome aboard. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan coming to you from the National Weather Service in Alaska region. And this is your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook for Monday, August 19th. We start out with the sea ice, and the ice continues to melt off here north of Prudhoe Bay. In fact, there were some lightning strikes reported around New Exit this Monday afternoon. And this will be the trend as relatively mild temperatures continue back toward the west. Still ice along the Russian Arctic coast, but this area is going to see increasing winds as a third storm, the strongest in a series of three storms, impacts this region as we get into Wednesday and Thursday. So what's going on here late tonight into Tuesday morning, we have a ridge of high pressure building up into the southern mainland, remnant low pressure, and a trailing front pushing down through the panhandle overnight and early on Tuesday. But the main weather maker, what was once Typhoon Ample, is going to continue tracking northeastward across the western Bering Sea and up toward the Bering Strait by the time we get into later Wednesday and Thursday. And this is going to be a pretty strong late summer, early fall storm. Not as powerful as Merbach was 2 years ago, but respectable. And so those of you along the west coast, especially within Norton Sound, the west-south side of the Seward Peninsula, and along the lower Yukon coast, especially north of Scammon Bay, you're going to want to secure property. Make sure you take precautions to safeguard property where you can, because this storm will have strong south-southwesterly winds that may gust 40 to 60 miles an hour and create within Norton Sound water levels 4 to 8 feet above normal high tide, in addition to the wave action from the surf. And by the time we get into Tuesday afternoon, the low center is still west of St. Lawrence, but the front arcing ahead of it will already have brought in stronger winds there to St. Lawrence Island by Tuesday, especially afternoon into Tuesday evening. Meanwhile, here across south central into the eastern mainland, this high pressure bringing sunnier weather, warmer afternoon temperatures after a rather rainy weekend in many spots. And then on Wednesday, the low takes up here the lower Chukchi Sea off the coastline there of Russia, and with it a little secondary trough coming through. On Wednesday, we're going to see winds become more southwesterly, coming right into Norton Sound up there around Nome. So these are the areas that on the west side of the Seward Peninsula. These areas will take the full brunt of this system, and we expect those conditions to persist at least into early Thursday morning. Also some moderate to locally heavier rain will fall on the southwest slopes here of the Brooks Range in the vicinity of Ambler. Could pick up another couple inches of rain, so the Kobuk River will see rises as a result of this storm. For the southeast panhandle on Tuesday, look for winds to be southerly 10 to 15 knots, Petersburg up to Juneau and Skagway. Waves 2 to 3 feet, Stevens Passage, Lynn Canal. Northwest winds 10 knots, Dixon Entrance waves a couple of feet. The outer coast winds will be west-northwest 10 to 15 knots, south of Gustavus off of Sitka and Craig. In the vicinity of Yakutat Bay, offshore flow 10 knots, west winds around 10 knots, Cape Suckling. And then on Wednesday, we expect variable winds around Cape Suckling coming on down the coast, northwest to north winds around 15 knots with swells generally 5-6 feet. For the inner channels, north to northwest winds 10 knots and waves generally running just a couple of feet. For the northwestern Gulf, north winds within Prince William Sound at 20 knots with waves of 3 feet. Outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance, north-northwest winds 20 knots. Strongest winds Tuesday will be out of the air at the entrance of Cook Inlet to northeast there of Kodiak Island. Look for northwesterly winds 25 to 30 knots, 6-foot swells. And then on Wednesday, relatively quiet conditions off the Kenai coast outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance. Variable winds to 10 knots. Look for an east wind to 10 knots within Prince William Sound. Waves a couple of feet there at best. And then throughout Cook Inlet, look for south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots with swells of 4 to 5 feet. On Tuesday, Kodiak Island will see westerly winds around 15 knots as we go down along the length of the Alaska Peninsula. The Pacific side, variable winds becoming easterly 15 to 20 knots. And then from the north side of the peninsula, winds will be 15 knots from the east out of Bristol Bay, but southeasterly 20 to 25 knots as you get out toward Cold Bay with waves of 3 to 4 feet. On Wednesday, winds across much of the region will be west-southwest, around 20 knots in the vicinity of Kodiak Island. On the North Pacific side, west winds to 15 knots, but west to southwest winds around 20 knots on the Bering side with swells 5 to 6 feet. And for Tuesday, the low center passing up well north of Shimia. You can see the core of higher waves associated with the strongest winds in the wake of the system. Look for southeast to south winds 20 to 25 knots over the eastern Aleutians, becoming southwesterly 20 knots through Atka and Adak, and then picking up to 30 to 40 knot gales there between Kiska and Shimia. And then for Wednesday, winds really come down across the region. Generally, southwesterly winds expected across the Aleutian chain at 15 knots, the eastern and central Aleutians, and then look for southwest winds to 20 knots over the western Aleutians. For areas of the west and southwest coast, 20-knot easterly winds, Bristol Bay, southeast winds to 30 knots, Kuskokwim Bay, and Etolan Strait. Look for south-southeast winds 25 to 30 knots, especially along the lower Yukon Delta. But to the west, you're going to see 45 knot southeasterly gales develop around St. Matthew and spreading up toward St. Lawrence Island by especially later in the afternoon and early evening. And then come Wednesday, this is when the full force of that system, once the fronts push on inland, we're looking down here in the south end, Bristol Bay 20-knot westerly winds, southwest winds to 30 knots into Bristol Bay, and southwest winds to 30 knots there around the Pribilofs. But as we get north of the Pribilofs, gale force winds to 40 knots, either south-southwest gales to 40 knots, waves upwards over 20 feet there at St. Matthew. And within Norton Sound, south winds to 40 knots. They may veer a little more southwesterly, but you're going to have water levels running 4 to 8 feet above normal high tide, in addition to the wave action. And we're seeing wave action within Norton Sound could be as high as 10 to 15 feet, especially there around Nome, Golovin. And then down along the outer Yukon coast, waves 10 to 12 feet. For areas south of the Bering Strait, winds will be southerly, south to southeast winds, 25 to 30 knots on Tuesday. Lower Chukchi south winds of 25 knots or so as we come up along the northwest coast, Point Leyte, Utqiagvik, more southwesterly winds, and those westerly increasing to 35 knots around Kaktovik with waves of 10 feet there. And then on Wednesday, strongest winds will be passing up in the vicinity of St. Lawrence Island along the west side of the Seward Peninsula, where we have that high wind watch and that coastal flood advisory in effect. Winds, south winds to 40 knots with higher gust. Lower Chukchi, we're looking at least at 30 to 35 knot southerly winds with swells of 8 to 10 feet. Southeast winds here off of the northwest coast, off of Wainwright, Utqiagvik, as well as we go down along the north slope to the eastern Arctic coast. Winds will fall off southeasterly to 15-knot offshore flow from Prudhoe Bay on through Kaktovik. So the main message is those of you along the west coast, along the Bering Strait south, down through the west and south sides of the Seward Peninsula and all along the Norton Sound and the lower Yukon Delta, please take time to secure property as we expect high winds, high surf, and storm surge that could cause some minor coastal flooding coming up here through midweek.